Welcome back, folks, to the 10-minute Bitcoin show. Gonna have you guys out of here before the next block. Saw some interesting stuff today that I wanted to talk about. This is a tweet from our resident merch, the guy that you see everywhere, pretty much in every Bitcoin technical discussion that's ever been. He's got this post. This post is from all the way back in 2018, right at the beginning of the year. For context, I believe that this was before the Bitcoin Cash fork. I'm pretty sure. We're going to look into that in a second here, but I want to talk about this first. So this is a screenshot of data of node counts from a tool created by Luke Dash Jr. And so let's take a look at this. I don't know if you can see this, but I'll read the text for you. So the big green bubble is Bitcoin Core nodes. And if we look at the text there, we can see that there were, boy, that's hard for me to even see. Can I zoom in on this? No. Of course, it only zooms in on the Twitter UI. That's annoying. All right. Let me pull this up on a different screen because I can't see it on that screen. So the Bitcoin Core nodes in this graphic that we're looking at right now was 97.38%. And it was, according to this data, right, this node counter produced by Luke. I don't know when he originally released this tool, but this data is from 2018. 160,785 Bitcoin Core nodes. And then you see there's some minority implementations over here on the right. The largest of which is the one that we're mainly going to talk about, which is the big pink sliver. So that's what I would call the leading minority alternative implementation here in this screenshot of data. That sliver that we see right here on the right is Bitcoin Unlimited nodes, and those are at 1.42%. That's 2,339 nodes as of the day that this data was taken on February 17th, 2018. Now this is relevant because if we were to fast forward to today and take a look at this same tool, hang on, my perspective's all out of whack here. Reset. There we go. Okay. If we were to look at this same data today, we would see this. This is using Luke's same tool. If you just go and look it up today, you'll see Bitcoin Core nodes are at 85.68% with a node count of 93,539, and Bitcoin NOTS nodes are at 14.12%. With a count of 15,412. Now, the first question you might have, which was my question, was why are these numbers so inflated compared to what you might see on some of the dashboards that aggregate node counts of various versions? Well, our resident merch has an answer to that question for us here because Brady Swenson asked that question back in 2018. He said, wow, why is this so much higher than the number on BitNodes or CoinDance? Today, we'd maybe look at like Clark Moody's dashboard or something. And Merch responded, seed nodes get contacted by all new nodes trying to connect to the Bitcoin network for the first time. Other services usually only gather nodes that allow incoming connections. So what Merch is telling us here is that the way that Luke has built this tool to aggregate this data gives us more information than most of the other tools that query the Bitcoin network to try to determine the total node counts. Luke's tool here is basically counting nodes that are not accepting incoming connections from other peers. So it gives us a rough idea of that there's a lot more activity on the Bitcoin network than just what you see on the surface, first of all. Like there's a bit of an iceberg here. But that's not really exactly what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is this. Because back in 2018, the leading minority implementation was Bitcoin Unlimited. And for those of you that are new today, you might not even know what that is. You might wonder, like, Bitcoin Unlimited, I've never even heard of that. Where is that? Why don't we switch to that? Well, Bitcoin Unlimited went on to become Bitcoin Cash. Before Bitcoin Cash actually forked off of the Bitcoin network, it was its own separate implementation that allegedly people were running because they preferred certain rules to be enforced by their software that were they had a different design direction that they wanted Bitcoin to go in than the leading implementation, which was Bitcoin Core at the time and still is, of course. And for a while, these two implementations kind of coexisted, and we can see that like on this data today, Like Bitcoin Unlimited is nowhere to be seen. And the reason for that is because in May of 2018, Bitcoin Unlimited became its own separate Bitcoin network. It became Bitcoin Cash. It forked off. And at that point, it no longer really became relevant in this Bitcoin node count because it became its own separate network. Now, my thoughts on this are nuanced, but as follows. I'll read this real quick. I suspect that the node counts are somewhat arbitrary since it really only matters if they're economic, and we can't effectively measure what of these nodes are economic. You know, how many of these are just being run by people aggregating data? How many of these are just empty nodes that have no wallet activity sitting on a virtual server somewhere? We have no idea. So in some respect, the node count is actually pretty arbitrary. It doesn't really matter that much because Bitcoin is Sybil resistant. You can't just like spin up a ton of nodes, having them enforce certain rules and have it matter at all because Bitcoin isn't designed that way. The market reveals this information to us gradually after there's a chain split where there's like, when you have two competing implementations and the implementations are trying to define what Bitcoin is, and you have two different user bases running those two different rule sets from two different software clients, inevitably you're going to end up on two different networks, right? Because sooner or later, those two implementations are going to disagree about consensus rules, whether one makes a change that the other rejects or the other rejects a change that the other's made or something to that effect. Eventually, inevitably, you end up with a split because you have two different maintainers attempting to define two different rule sets. There's no way for those rule sets to maintain their synchronization without following the same change process. That's my opinion anyway. So the reason that the market reveals to us gradually, you know, whether the economic relevance of these node counts later on down the line only after a chain split is because we have to see the market react to the emergence of two tokens on two different networks. So like when these implementations do inevitably eventually disagree about the rules, well, then it's up to users to decide which software they're going to run because they're determining which token they want to buy in exchange for goods and services when transacting peer-to-peer, which token they're going to dump and use to buy more of the token that they prefer. So in this case, let's say that these NOTs nodes and the Bitcoin Core nodes eventually soon disagree on consensus rules and split into two separate networks, like what happened with Bitcoin Unlimited. We're gonna know it's gonna be emergent at that point. We're gonna see it unfold gradually. What the market prefers, what percentage of these Bitcoin NOTs nodes are actually economic, and how many of them are just Sybil, right? Like how many of them are just fake, pretending to be real users and aren't actually real users. And again, we won't get like an accurate idea of how many of the numbers are fake, but we will see the market will gradually over time reveal, like just like it did with Bitcoin Cash, right? In the beginning with Bitcoin Cash, it was a little ambiguous. Right out of the gate, it seemed like Bitcoin Cash was shooting right up right when it first released on Coinbase, and then Coinbase crashed like it always does, and then it came back online and the price crashed and pretty much has continued to crash ever since. But they certainly tried to create this perception in the very beginning that it was that there was a lot more market demand there than there actually was. So yeah, just kind of a gradual overview here. I think it's really hard to parse anything super useful out of these numbers, out of this data, other than higher level concepts, which is just that like we don't see Bitcoin Unlimited on here anymore. And I suspect the day will come that we won't see NOTs on here anymore, because inevitably we end up with two different networks because we're talking about two competing implementations of the node software. And the node software decides what the rules are that you want to enforce for your Bitcoin wallet. Like what if you want to transact with other peers on the network and you want them to abide by the same rules as you, whatever rules you're enforcing locally, like if you're not compatible with the rest of the network, then you're going to be in your own different network with your own different token. That's why this whole idea of the reference implementation gets to define what Bitcoin is. Like, of course, that has to be the case, because if you have two different maintainers coming up with two different definitions for what Bitcoin is and how you need to play in the network, you're going to end up with two different networks with two different tokens. To me, that's obvious. I don't know why that seems to be a sticking point for people in Bitcoin. They think that we can have all of these alternative implementations that can coexist. I think it's inevitable. I think it's inevitable that this ends up all yellow again, and we end up with two tokens.